Today's project, Anticlastic bangle with a hammered finish on the inside and a herringbone pattern on the outside. However you want to do it, it's just that I want a pattern on both sides of the metal for a change for this one. Get the size bangle that you're going to use, measure the inside diameter, add the thickness of the metal. Now I'm using 1 millimeter thick metal, 14 millimeters wide. I'm going to put a double texture on this, and what often happens is when you put a texture on one side and you go to put a texture on the other side, you hammer out part of your texture. So what I'm going to do is a herringbone pattern, which doesn't take many marks, on the inside, and then on the outside I'm going to have a hammered finish. So I'm just using the small round part of my frets chasing hammer. So onto the anvil. So I'm just using my little jeweler's hammer with the wedge end. And then 90 degrees. So you can see that's a nice little herringbone pattern that doesn't deform a lot of the metal. And once we get this on, we'll hallmark it before we do the hammering, otherwise we'll end up with a mark for the hallmark. I hallmarked this quite deep because I want to be able to hammer and still have it visible. So this is the back, and I'm going to just use this and it doesn't have to be perfect. It can be a little bit random, but try to get your hammer marks everywhere. I got both sides patterned now. When I bought this metal, it was dead soft, so I was able to do all of my patterning, and it's still soft enough that I can form it with my hands. At this point, because you've hammered on the end, file the ends flat, because you'll have little bits that are deformed. Check it against the safe side of your file, make sure it's flat. And because it was annealed, you can just form it with your fingers. If you're having trouble bending your metal, anneal it. Always. If you're working with your metal and it's difficult to work, anneal it, always. Take your time, get your ends lined up as perfectly as you can, and make sure they have tension holding them together. I'm just resting this with the joint against my charcoal block with a little bit of pressure from my third hand. Mix your flux, put a little line where the joint is, and hard solder. And I'm cutting a piece about 8 millimeters long. It's fairly long, but we want to be able to solder this with minimal cleanup, and that should be enough to fill both front and back. You could use a couple of smaller pieces if you want. Once again, I'm using a number 7 tip. on my mini torch. Dry out the flux. Make sure that your solder is correctly placed. So I have it laying right in the join. Now I'm going to crank the heat up because this is a fairly big piece of metal. And I don't want to spend any longer than necessary. So I'm about 75 mil away, just circling the join. It'll come up to temperature quickly. The flux will go clear, and the solder will flow. So there we are, shift to the other side, make sure that it's flowed all the way. So quench it in water, have a look, and if everything's right in the world, it'll be just a thin solder join, so that'll clean up quite easily. Pickle it and round it up before you sand that. Out of the pickle, rinse it, dry it off, and it hasn't been in long enough for the oxides to come off yet, but I just wanted it so that the flux would come off so that I could work it. I'll deal with the oxides later. So round it up on your bracelet mandrel with a rawhide hammer. Flip it over just like you would a ring on a ring mandrel so you don't get a taper. Doesn't have to be perfect, but close to round would be nice. And this is just so, oh, we're crooked. This is just so that we can sand this back, just sanding the smallest amount possible. Because on the top of a curve, with that small amount of solder, you shouldn't have to get into your pattern. So only sand it the amount that you need. Preferably everything will be perfect. Because we do want to make sure that the solder is gone. So there you go, there's that. Not bad. The inside isn't bad, but what I've got a hammered finish in there, and what I want to do is just use the black abrasive wheel. It's about like 400 sandpaper, and once again the smallest amount of cleanup possible. I'm just touching it right on the join. Now, if you erased any of your pattern, now's the time to put it back in. So we go on the bracelet mandrel, and where my join is here is good. I don't need to do anything. If I needed to put anything back in, you just make sure that it's tight against the mandrel, and you can put your marks over the top of where you soldered. Now for the inside, it's not much more difficult. We just go on our little bench block, take the hammer that you made the marks with, And just like that. So now we're ready to form it. So I'm using a Delrin hammer, plastic hammer, wedge, and a sinusoidal stake, and I'll hammer on this one first. No, I'll hammer on the big one first, and we go right to the bottom. Moving the bracelet as we hammer because we don't want any ripples on the sides. When you get to the bottom of this, you'll be able to hear the sound change, and then we'll switch to the next smaller one. So just hammer straight down into the groove and move your piece underneath. That one's done. Now the smaller one. So just keep working until you hear it hit the bottom again. When you've got to the bottom of this groove, go back over, check if there are any ripples on the edge. Just go back. You can just work on the edge, tidy that up, work all the way around. Now at this point, it'll probably be a bit wonky. It's not perfectly round. Not a drama. Back on your bracelet mandrel and just hit in the groove. Yeah. Just hit in the groove where it's high. Work your way around. Don't hit the edge or you'll undo all of your hard work. When you get it round, this needs to go back in the pickle a little bit to get the oxides off, and then in the tumbler, and it's finished.